Yes, as mentioned, I will be focusing on life cycle assessment, and I will introduce a little bit what the JRC is doing in this respect, and especially my group, which is dealing with life cycle assessment. Just to clarify, this will be a presentation that, of course, is linking also with the policies, but at the JRC, we are actually developing scientific and technical support for different policies. So we are not, let's say, the policymakers are those that are supporting some technical reflection, and this reflection is what I would like to share with you today. Via some contents that I organize as follows. The idea is to share the work we are doing on understanding the EU food system in its entirety and aspects of the circularity, which is also part of the title of the session. Then, which are the environmental impacts associated with the food system that we are modeling, and also the way in which we are using LCA to assess the food system, but also to assess the potential for alternative proteins. I will also mention another initiative that is making use of the life cycle assessment, which is the recently developed Safe and Sustainable by Design framework, which is aiming at steering innovation and is using for the sustainability part the LCA. And I conclude with a couple of challenges and opportunities that are very much linked also with the presentation of the other colleagues and speakers this morning. So indeed, the first point is we need to understand a very complex food system. This is an illustration of the material flow analysis. So a first of its kind analysis of the masses of the food system in Europe. Where we are also taking into consideration, the amount of food or feed that we are importing as input to the system, the heavy processing that we are having of our food, then aspect of the distribution and the consumption. And in this type of models, we are also addressing how circular is the system. So which are elements that are leaving, let's say, this linear part of the model and are available as byproducts or as food waste for other uses, either re-entering the food system directly or indirectly. But one may ask, okay, with this helicopter view of the food system, which are the associated impacts? And what we do with the aspects that today are not yet circular. So the literature is very vast on the possible uses of different types of food waste that you see on the left of this graph, and the value-added products, including proteins, that you can extract from that. So this is one way in which we can have even more circular our food system, but where we are relying a lot on biotechnologies and green chemistry, because all these transformations are not just a direct use of the food waste or the byproduct, but have either a simple or more complex number of transformation. And again, our question can be, which are the associated impact with this transformation? So this is where we have the life cycle assessment entering into place, because we are using extensively this method to support policymaking, but to support different types of analysis. And I'm glad that also the previous speakers mentioned footprints, mentioned the recipe method, so mentioned elements that are the way in which we are trying to structure the evaluation of different aspects. So in a nutshell, for those of you that are not familiar with life cycle assessment, this is a systematic approach to address all along the life cycle of a product, both the resources that are needed and the emissions in the environment that are occurring along each life cycle step. That is trying to embrace really all the value chains to foster the comprehensiveness in addressing resource use, emissions, but also the impacts, In unveiling the trade-offs, the previous question by Hannah was actually pointing on a very well-known trade-off, but the food system, as many other systems, are plenty of this trade-off. What we have to ensure is that we are very systematic in the way in which we address the trade-offs to then define a mitigation strategy when we are then supporting one solution or another. And then this idea of embracing the entire life cycle can address also elements which are going beyond the environment, and this will be presented also afterwards by other speakers, like, for example, Alessandra Zamagni, on addressing and not only environmental, but also socioeconomic impact. So the structure of the life cycle is really this comprehensiveness in terms of impacts, but also on value chains. Very briefly, and to understand also the subsequent point on the use of life cycle assessment, how we perform this type of studies. We define a goal and scope of the study and also the system boundary of the study. We perform a systematic collection of data and information on emissions, on the resources, and we then transform via model, and in the case of environment, of course, environmental modeling, we translate the thousands of different input data that are collected into a number of impacts. Now, of course, it's very prominent, the discussion on the carbon footprint, but there are many more footprints. In particular, the recommendation now at the EU level is for 16 different categories of impacts. And you can easily grasp that it's a way in which you can indeed address a number of different trade-offs in alternatives and solutions. These impacts can be further aggregated if you want to look more at the impacts that are having a direct implication on human health or on ecosystem quality and biodiversity, or the availability of natural resources. And usually a study on life cycle assessment has a last step, which is the interpretation, which very often is not the end of the study, but is also where an iterative process starts, especially when life cycle assessment is used to compare options in an innovation setting. So where we want to see a new alternative that is put into place against, for example, an incumbent technologies. Actually, life cycle assessment is not the new kid on the block. Even at the level of the EU policies, in the last 30 years, from the early 1990, there was an increase mentioning or reference to life cycle assessment, to life cycle thinking, to life cycle costing, and also to the PEF-OEF, which are the EU recommendation for life cycle assessment, into policies. I'm not expecting you to read through the individual policies here, but it's just to have an idea that it's really a wide body of different legislation, up to the fact that since 2015, life cycle assessment is considered a tool in the EU Commission Better Regulation Toolbox. That means if we want to have a future-proof policies that are more comprehensive in the evaluation of policy options, we need to integrate this type of considerations. And among the policies that maybe are more of interest today, of course, life cycle assessment is mentioned there, including in the Biotechnology Act. So including in the, let's say, fringes that are more toward technologies applied to different sectors, including to the food sector. And which type of tool we have at hand that are integrating life cycle assessment and that could help steering and supporting our innovation. On one side, there is the environmental footprint maps, which is the current European Commission recommendation for the way to conduct an LCA study when we want to compare product A with product B. But as I mentioned before, we might be interested also to understand what is happening at the macro scale, not only comparing to products, but also looking at how product, by the intensity of their consumption, results in impacts. And this is the so-called consumption footprint model. So it's a model in which we are selecting representative product at the EU level, and we consider their impact when multiplied by the intensity of the consumption. And we are doing this study also for the food, and I will briefly mention this afterwards. And then we can do the same, that it's applied at the macro scale, to assess individual consumption. So to see our individual basket of products, our diets, our way of living, how much this results in impacts. Starting with the product environmental footprint methods, this is really a detailed guidance to support the comparison of products, focusing very much on products already on the market. So helping really a comparison that today might support, let's say, choice also by consumer, but also the communication business to business of the life cycle based data and performance. The idea is to provide a level playing field for operator and to guarantee the reliability of environmental information. Because an important disclaimer when referring to LCA is that LCA is a method that leaves a certain room of maneuver to select models for evaluating the impacts, to select the data. So if we have not requirements that are very strict in what we need to do to perform the study, we might end up in results that are not really comparable. So the idea of the product environmental footprint is to enhance the comparability of study having really the same rules of the game. And this is super important to foster the transparency for decision-making in business, but also by consumers. Then I mentioned this consumption footprint model. We are not focusing only on food, we focus on several areas of consumption, but the characteristic of this is that we are conducting on one hand the life cycle assessment of representative product, but on the other side, as I mentioned, we assess the consumption intensity. And we use these 16 environmental indicators, matching also some other sustainability considerations. For example, how much these impacts are overcoming or not the so-called planetary boundaries, or how much they are contributing to sustainability, and especially to the achievement of targets and ambitions of the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we look at that with an helicopter view for Europe, the light blue bar is how much food is prominent as impact compared to other categories of impacts in a single weighted score. So if we are trying to have a single indicator out of the 16. Of course, we can look also at the individual indicators. And this is in a platform that you can access. All the data can be accessed and downloaded, where we have the zoom for Europe, but also data and information for individual member states. And this is also part of the recently released EU Food System Monitoring Dashboard, where the consumption footprint food has been selected as one of the official indicators for this monitoring system, and where we can see that over time our consumption footprint of the food is increasing, and as has been showed also by the previous speakers, of course, the part that is related to protein, meat, and dairy, these first two on the bottom right, are basically determining almost half of the entire impact. So how we can move from this situation to a situation where we are reducing the impacts, still having a dietary scenario which is respecting, let's say, the need to sustain people and lives. Basically, life cycle assessment is really meant for address and to assess different possible solutions in a, let's say, complex policy mix or intervention mix. Because, of course, we can compare different diets and where also there is a different contribution of different types of proteins. All of the topics that are under discussion in the Environmental Footprint Agricultural Working Group to try to have the most robust approach to be able to compare these management practices, always with this idea of covering the entire life cycle, but then also to design alternatives. And if you look at the literature, the application of life cycle assessment on alternative proteins, on cultured meat, has already a long tradition. It's more than 10 years that we have papers that are addressing in one way or in the other the comparison of options, and also the challenges that we might have comparing systems of alternative proteins that have very different backgrounds. In one side, for example, something which is related to primary production in agriculture, and on the other side, maybe something which is more biotech-based and lab-based. So now the sustainability challenges for alternative proteins are clearly defined in literature through different lenses, aspect of acceptability, aspect of technological challenges, nutritional challenges, safety challenges, regulatory challenges, and so on and so forth. But of course, we have also a clear challenge on the sustainability lens. So how we can ensure that alternative proteins may bring more benefits than burdens. And this is where I would refer to the recommendation for safe and sustainable by design chemicals and materials, which are a recent recommendation released by the Commission to steer innovation, where aspects of the safety and the sustainability are going hand in hand, and where the sustainability is addressed via life cycle assessment, with the idea to avoid regrettable substitution. So to ensure that the alternatives that are put into place are actually maximizing the benefits and minimizing the trade-off. Yes, because if we go towards sustainable alternative proteins in the food system, we have a number of challenges and opportunities. There is a projections that the global market will grow for these alternative proteins, and there are a number of benefits that are expected. But it's true that the different type of proteins might need a number of steps in their processing that are related to more energy consumption compared to maybe other alternatives, or to the need of a number of input to the production, like solvents, like specific elements and resources that might be needed to help the technology to deliver the product that we need as alternative input to our diet. And this is where, again, it's important that this is addressed in a manner that is really very aware of all the steps that are going from the origin, the design of the new alternative, and what will be the use by consumer, but also what will be the end of life. On one side, for the overall sustainability, and I stress again this need of trade-off, but also the interrelation analysis of the different supply chains. So how much the supply chain of the alternative proteins will anyway rely on other aspects of the food supply chain, but also aspect of affordability. And this will be more linked with life cycle costing and social life cycle assessment, but to ensure that there is also the possibility for these technologies to end up with products that have a cost that can be afforded. So I conclude with that. It's clear that we need alternative proteins for a transition to sustainable food system. We need a system approach, because we cannot allow, let's say, that we are just focusing on certain elements of the value chain, forgetting others, and considering all actors and the sustainability dimension. And we firmly believe that life cycle assessment is instrumental to address this impact along the entire value chain, but also to steer the innovation. We really have to concentrate for avoiding regrettable substitution. Thanks a lot.